Studios.
In this week's episode, we're going to talk about two different stories, both involving something lost, a treasure. Now let's be honest, who doesn't like a good treasure hunt? Because there's one thing about these Appalachian mountains, it has plenty of those kinds of stories. Stories about things that were lost, hidden, or buried. Sometimes it's bodies, and sometimes it's treasure. Gold, silver, lost Confederate payroll. People hiding their valuables and wealth because they didn't trust the government. They didn't trust the banks. And they didn't trust their neighbors either. In the first story, we're going to take a look at one of the most well-known lost treasures in these mountains, tied to real places that people are still searching for, even today. And in the second one, we're going to turn to another story, one that doesn't get as much attention and usually just circulates within the treasure hunting community. That one involves a family's buried treasure that was never found. Or was it? Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday, and if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. If you spend enough time in these mountains, you start to notice something about the stories that come from them. They don't usually stay where they started. They get pushed from one place to another, told and retold until they settle wherever someone's willing to believe them. After a while, it gets hard to tell where the story started and how much of it's been changed over time. But there's one story that's been circulating through Appalachia for a long time. A silver mine, hidden somewhere in these hills, mined in secret, then lost or forgotten. And the name tied to it is Jonathan Swift. Swift was born in Philadelphia in 1712 and later moved to Alexandria, Virginia, where he learned seafaring and became a captain of a ship. At some point, he'd met a man named George Munday, who claimed he had been taken captive by Native Americans and brought deep into the mountains of what is now southwestern Virginia and eastern Kentucky. And it was there where he claimed he had seen large amounts of silver ore in a cave that they had kept him captive in. And what Munday talked about wasn't just a description of silver. It was something he had been told while he was there, a line that's been passed around this region for a long time. It's often attributed to a Cherokee war leader named Bob Benji. And he told Munday that if the white man knew what he knew about these mountains, that he could shoe their horses cheaper with silver than with iron. Now, whether it was said that way exactly or not, there's no way to prove it. But men paid attention to it, not because he talked about silver in these mountains, but because of how he made it sound. Like there was a lot of it. And what makes that part matter a little more is where Benji was known to operate, around Stone Mountain, in what is now known as High Knob area of Wise County, Virginia. So when you tie that back to Monday's account, and then to Swift deciding to go looking for it, you're not dealing with a story floating around. You're dealing with something that may have been rooted a lot closer to here than people are willing to consider. So, Munday convinced Swift to finance an expedition into the wild frontier where he said he could lead him back to this cave. So Swift, Munday, and an expedition team went in search of this silver. And Swift, being a man of the seas, was by trade an avid record keeper. He kept accounts, directions, landmarks, and descriptions of the route they went on. As they traveled the rough and dangerous terrain, Munday eventually led Swift back to the cave, somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, where they found a rich vein of silver. Not a trace, not a small deposit, but enough to mine, smelt, and carry out in bars. And not just once. They returned multiple times, mining the cave and bringing more silver out. This wasn't a one-time discovery. They had hit the jackpot. All the while, Swift keeping records about their adventures. And carrying that much silver out of the mountains would have been a feat in itself. And according to the journal, Swift didn't just mine silver and carry it out. He buried some of it. According to an article in an 1886 edition of Harper's Magazine, the oldest continuously published monthly magazine, Swift and his men would take part of what they brought out and hide it along the way, placing it in different locations throughout the mountains. The reason it makes sense when you think about it. Moving large amounts of silver through remote terrain wasn't easy, and it wasn't something you'd want to be seen doing. Breaking it up and hiding portions along the route gave them a way to move in stages to come back for it later. Some of those hiding places were said to be marked, not in obvious ways, but with small signs that they would only make sense to someone who already knew that they were looking for. Carvings in trees, stacked stones, landmarks tied to the directions in the journals. Over time, that part of the story took on a life of its own. So instead of one lost mine, now you have the possibility of multiple hidden treasures, scattered across the same mountains, that the people have been searching for generations. Which means even if the mine was lost, that might not have been the only thing left behind. For years, those writings have been studied and debated by people trying to figure out where that mine was located. Jonathan Swift's journals were supposedly left to his one and only love interest, a widow, only ever known as Miss Renfro from Tennessee. Most versions place it in eastern Kentucky, in the steep mountainsides. That's where people are drawn to. Some spent months, others years, and some lifetimes, trying to match the journals to real terrain. Ever so often, someone claims they got close by finding markings on a rock, old dig sites, or smelters, but no one has ever been able to prove it. Others say Swift wasn't the first person to go looking for this silver. There are accounts of Spanish explorers moving through these parts of Appalachia long before him, searching for mineral wealth. Some of those accounts describe small, hidden mining operations, where there was evidence of something being removed from the earth. So the question comes up, did Swift find something new, or did he find something already there? However it started, the mine didn't stay in operation. Apparently Swift, who relied heavily on landmarks and his writings to return to the silver mine, went blind. So, he was never able to pass on its location to others. Some say the directions were coded. Others say the mine was sealed on purpose, so no one would ever find it. And that's where the story usually ends, a lost silver mine in Kentucky, with just enough detail to keep people searching, and just enough missing to keep them from finding it. But if you look closer, something doesn't add up. There's another name that comes up from time to time when people start looking into this story, and it doesn't come from the journals. It comes from right here in this region. A man known as Money-Making Sol, Solomon Mullins. He was born in 1782 and lived in what was then called Holly Creek, now Clintwood, Virginia, not far from Pine Mountain. According to local accounts, Mullins was known for producing counterfeit coins. But what made him stand out wasn't just that he was making them. It was what they were made from. People said his coins contained a higher amount of silver than the original currency itself at the time, enough that they were actually worth more in weight than their actual face value. And that raised a question nobody could clearly answer. Where was he getting all this silver from? Some believed he had found a source somewhere in the mountains near his land, possibly in one of the caves along Pine Mountain. Others took it a step further, suggesting he'd come across part of what Swift had left behind, or even Swift's mine itself. The way he operated only added to the story. It said he would melt the silver down and create dyes by pressing heated metal over real coins, then finish the process in caves along cliffs near his property, places that are still referred to as Sol's Cliffs. Before the Secret Service was formed in 1865 to combat counterfeiting, it fell into the hands of the U.S. Marshals, and one of those marshals eventually caught up to Sol, right in the middle of making his counterfeit coins. According to the story, Mullins tried to coerce the marshal into helping him, hoping he would want to be part of his operation, telling him to take a hammer and strike the metal. It didn't work, and in 1837, Mullins and his two sons were charged with counterfeiting. He left the area before his trial, so either the government dropped the case, thinking the trial was more trouble than it was worth. Or maybe they let him off for other reasons. Saul later died in 1858, and through all that, he never revealed where the silver came from. Now, the directions themselves to the location of Swift's mine don't read like a precise map. They describe movement in terrain, a river, a mountain gap, a forked creek, a rock overhang, a ridge, features you can find across a wide part of Appalachia. So here are the directions from Swift's journal. You come to the Great Gap where waters divide. From there, you find two creeks forming a Y, one clear, the other choked with laurel. You follow the rough branch to a rock house or overhang where the men stayed. Then two standing stones mark a narrow valley, one 15-foot high and one 20-foot high. You will then see a rock face shaped like a human pointing towards the setting sun. Nearby, a beech tree with a compass and trowel carved into its bark. The mine lies under a hanging rock near a small stream, hidden behind loose stone and brush. That sounds specific, but it doesn't lead to one place. Those features exist all over this region. And that's where people get hung up. The directions fit more than one location. The Great Gap alone sends people to places like the Cumberland Gap or the Breaks. But when you compare the details closely, things don't quite line up exactly in Kentucky. Distances feel off. Travel times don't match the terrain. Some river references don't fit cleanly. So the question becomes, what if the problem isn't the directions, but it's where we've been placing them? If you look east from Kentucky into southwestern Virginia, those same descriptions begin to fit more naturally. Older travel routes, tighter river valleys, terrain that matches the timelines better. And then there's something else. In Tannersville, Virginia, during the construction of a house in the 1980s, while excavating for the foundation, crews came across something strange, something that was later determined to be a seam of silver ore. Now that changes the conversation. It shows silver does exist in these parts, contrary to what all the geological surveys say. And once you know that, the idea of a mine doesn't feel out of place. It raises another question. If silver showed up there, how many other places were never recorded or were found and never talked about? This region wasn't documented the way it is now. Land changed hands without records. Places were used and abandoned. Over time, what was known could disappear. So let's go back to the story. You had a group working in mine, making multiple trips, then stopping. That doesn't require a large operation, just a workable vein of silver and some knowledge of the area. If that location wasn't where people have been searching, then for generations, they've been following the right story, just looking in the wrong place. And once you think about that and consider it, that changes the story. Not something impossible to solve, but something that shifted just enough to stay out of reach. It may not be a hidden entrance waiting to be found. It could be something simpler, a collapsed cut in the hillside, a shallow working covered over time, a place that no longer looks like anything at all. Not hidden, just gone. But stories like this don't last without something behind them. And if Swift was bringing silver out more than once, then that place existed, at least for a time. So maybe the truth sits somewhere in between. Not a great lost mine waiting to be found, but not nothing either. Something real, worked just enough to matter, then left behind before it was ever properly recorded. The roots of this story are still tied to something real. Minerals in the ground, people moving through these mountains, work done without a record. The shadows are everything that came after, the changing locations, the misread directions, the years spent searching in the wrong place. And maybe the reason no one has ever been able to say, this is it, isn't because the mine was never there. Maybe it's because they've been looking in the wrong hills all along. If you go looking for treasure in these mountains of Appalachia, most people are going to expect gold, coins buried in the ground, something hidden away during the Civil War, waiting to be found. But the truth is, if you go searching in Saltville, Virginia, the most valuable thing in Saltville was never gold. It was salt. This town, located in the far southwestern part of the state, in Smith County, is rich in all kinds of history, even things that are extinct. And by 1864, Saltville wasn't just another town in these mountains. It was one of the most important industrial sites in the Confederacy. The salt works there were producing millions of bushels, enough to supply a large portion of the South with its much-needed salt demands. Food preservation depended on it. The armies of the South depended on it. And because of that, Saltville became a target. Union forces didn't come through by accident. They came for the salt, and when they did, they came hard. Fighting broke out in October of 1864, where 2,800 Confederate troops held off a Union attack of 5,200 men. But that victory was short-lived. A few months later, on December 20th, Union General Stoneman and his troops defeated the remaining Confederate forces, mostly made up of Home Guard and local militia. And by the time it was over, the salt works had been destroyed, buildings burned, salt kettles and furnaces demolished. What had been one of the most important places in the region was left in pieces. And when something like that happens, people don't think long term. They think about what they have and what they're about to lose. Money, supplies, anything that can be taken. And with the town hearing that soldiers were moving in, and with no way of knowing what was coming next, hiding your valuables would have made perfect sense. And that's where this story begins. There was a man named Abraham Smith. Smith was a wealthy landowner who lived on a large tract of land just outside the town with his 2 sons. Abraham had acquired his wealth through trade, business, and connections to the salt works itself. So, when Smith got wind that Union troops were heading towards Saltville in October of 1864, Smith and his 2 sons gathered up all the family's valuables, worth over $60,000 at that time, in gold and silver coins, watches, and jewelry, and buried them under the roadbed not too far from their house, somewhere between Saltville and Allison's Gap. In essence, Smith had put the treasure right under people's feet. And if the bulk of that was gold, that treasure would be worth about $12 million today. Smith and his 2 sons were planning on escaping to Tennessee to avoid the looming battle. While fleeing, and with all the commotion of people leaving the area, somehow Eli, the youngest son, got separated from his family. Abraham, unable to find his son amongst the cannons booming and the bullets whizzing by, reluctantly continued on to Tennessee, where he would wait out the war. After the war, Abraham and his remaining family returned to Saltville, still without knowing the fate of young Eli. When Abraham and his oldest son went to retrieve the family fortune from the roadbed, much to their surprise, it was gone. So now Abraham not only had a missing son, but he was also penniless. In 1866, just over a year after the war had come to an end, Abraham receives a letter, and the content of that letter was written from someone Smith did not know, and it started out like this. Abraham Smith, kind sir, I am in great pain and upon my deathbed, and I feel I must divest my conscience of a burden that has kept constant company with my soul. Shortly after we fought for the salt works there in your town, we found your son Eli concealed along the road in some bushes. We captured him and took him prisoner, believing him to be a scout for the Confederacy. He feared he would be hanged after his capture, and he made an arrangement with my first sergeant, Silas Vance, that he would share with him the location of the family treasure, valued over $60,000, in exchange that your son would be released and assisted in his escape to Tennessee. After learning the location of the treasure, my first sergeant killed your son and informed his superiors that he was attempting to escape and provide information to the enemy of strategic Union positions. I assisted my first sergeant Silas in moving your treasure, and we concealed it in a cave about 1/4 mile from the Old Town Church. The plan was to destroy the entrance and return after the war to recover it. but my first sergeant slipped as he ignited the powder and was killed in the explosion. I myself was wounded in a battle just outside of 7 Mile Ford and have been unable to travel since. It was my intention to return to Saltville and reveal the location of your money to you, but I am dying, and I wish you to know that I took no part in the murder of your son. Respectfully, Abner Wright, 12th Ohio Cavalry, Army of the United States. So, now knowing the fate of his missing son, grieving, Abraham and his eldest tried to find the location of the cave with the very limited information that he had. And with the entrance having been blasted shut, that would have made it much more difficult to find, as it would appear to look like just any other part of the hillsides. So after searching for years, the loss of his son and the loss of his fortune caught up with him, and he died early, never finding his fortune or never knowing the location of his son's grave. Now here's where it ties back in. From the letter we heard, hidden in a cave about a half mile from the Old Town Church. Now, if you're from around here and you start thinking about Old Town churches in Saltville, the one that comes to mind is Madam Russell Church. But that church wasn't built until the late 1800s. However, there was an earlier church that might line up better with the story. This church was called Elizabeth Chapel, and it was built on land donated by Elizabeth Madam Russell, the sister of Patrick Henry, in another area of town. So, thinking like a treasure hunter, if Smith buried the treasure originally under the road leading to Allison's Gap section of town, it would stand to reason that the 2 Union soldiers wouldn't have wanted to move it very far. For one, it probably weighed a lot, and 2, for the risk of being discovered. So when you hear all this and try to put it together, the story isn't really about how much was buried, or even exactly where it might be. It comes down to something simpler, whether anything like this could have happened at all. And when you look at Saltville during the Civil War, the answer to that part is yes. You had one of the most important industrial sites in the Confederacy. You had large amounts of supplies and money coming in and out of Saltville to keep the salt works running. And you had 2 major events in late 1864. Union forces came in, fighting broke out, and then, not long after, the salt works were destroyed. That's not speculation. That's documented. So, the idea that someone in Abraham Smith's situation might have taken what they had and hidden it somewhere along a known approach into the valley, that doesn't require much imagination. It fits the moment. As I was digging deeper into this story, I felt I needed to try to find someone who was very familiar with it, maybe someone who had been looking for it for themselves. So I went searching on a local level and found a treasure hunter by the name of Larry Hogston, a man who has been all over these hills for decades. Still searching for treasure today, he shares his finding on his YouTube channel, Saving Local History. Larry told me that he had spent years looking into this story. Not casually either. He had gone through land records, tracked property lines, tried to match names from the time period to actual places on the ground. He had looked at Civil War rosters, trying to confirm whether the people tied to the story were even there when it was supposed to have happened. He wasn't guessing. He was trying to prove it. And over time, he had built his own idea of where it might have been, following that same stretch of land between Allison's Gap and Saltville, looking at old roadbeds, low ground, places that would have made sense for someone trying to hide something quickly and come back later, trying to locate old mines and caves. He told me he had spent years researching and looking for it, walking the ground, checking the same areas more than once, trying to line the story up with something real. And when I asked him what he believed, he was quick to answer. He said he thought the whole thing was made up, that the letter written to Abraham Smith was a fake. Something created over time by someone local to bring people into Saltville. Now, that might be the truth. No one really knows for sure. But I'll tell you, as someone who has hunted for treasure myself, there was something about how quickly he answered and just how certain he was about it that caught my attention. Because most people who spend that kind of time going through records, walking the land, trying to line everything up, they usually have a lot more to say about it. Most of the time, they'll tell you how far they got, or what didn't quite make sense to them, or what they think might still be out there. But with him, it was simple. He had spent the time, looked into it, and made up his mind. And maybe that's all there is. Or maybe he knows more than he's letting on. And here's where the story starts to separate from what can be proven. Because for all the detail in the military records, for all the records that describe the terrain, the roads, the fighting, there's nothing that confirms a man named Abraham Smith burying a cache of gold. No record of it being recovered. No mention of it being found. Nothing that ties the story to a specific documented event. Not in official records. Not in recorded history. But in memory. Passed down. Changed a little over time. Attached to a real place and a real moment until it feels like it doesn't belong there. And that's where most treasure stories would end. Somewhere out there, still waiting to be found. But Saltville doesn't really work like that. Because if you look at the ground a little closer, what's been buried there and what's been left behind doesn't always look the way people expect. And maybe there was a man named Abraham Smith. Maybe something was buried. And maybe it was never found. But the one thing we know for certain is that this ground holds things that were left behind, and that not all of them were meant to be found, and not all of them were treasure. Because the roots of this story, they're tied to a real place, a moment, a time when people were trying to hold on to what they had, while everything else around them was coming apart. But the shadows, they're everything that wasn't written down, the missing names, the unmarked places, the things buried in the ground that don't show up on any map. And maybe that's why stories like this last, because people go looking for gold, and what they find instead is something that was never meant to be found. And maybe that's the common thread between both of these stories. One of them spread out across these mountains, moving over time, pulling people from one place to another, always just a little out of reach. The other stayed right where it started, tied to one place, one moment, and still just as uncertain. But in both cases, people have spent generations trying to track something down, following directions, stories, and pieces that never quite line up the same way twice. And after all that time, no one's been able to stand in one place and say for certain, this is it. Because sometimes, it's not about something being hidden well. Sometimes, it's about something being lost at just the right moment and never making its way back. And if you caught what I said earlier in this episode about me being a treasure hunter myself, well, in full disclosure, when I was younger, I too went looking for the Abraham Smith's treasure after reading about it in a book I found. I always believed it was on a ridge behind a small town church, but not the church that everyone else did. And like Abraham Smith, I too came back empty-handed, or at least, that's what I've always said. Because just like Larry Hoxton, do treasure hunters really reveal everything they know? This has been Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memories. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.